Back in 2004, Hugo and Eisner Award-winning writer J. Michael Straczynski and Bryce Zabel, the writer and producer who created Dark Skies and also worked on Lois and Clark, The New Adventures of Superman, got together to write a pitch for a new Star Trek series. Enterprise was about to start what would be its final season, and it was 2 years since the release of the most recent film in the franchise, Star Trek Nemesis, which was a critical and commercial disappointment. The future of Star Trek looked uncertain for the first time in nearly 20 years. Straczynski and Zabel's proposal charted a course for that future that would allow the franchise to revisit its celebrated past. Their pitch, titled Star Trek Reboot the Universe, called for a return to the era and the characters of Star Trek the original series. Captain Kirk, Spock, Dr. McCoy, the rest of the classic crew of the Starship Enterprise, played by new, younger actors, setting off on a 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds. The pitch, which is available to read in its entirety online, describes a 2-hour pilot episode that tells the story of how Kirk and McCoy first meet Spock and how they all find themselves aboard the Enterprise with their soon-to-be legendary crew. There's a lot of promise in that pitch, I think. With a lot of development, it could have grown into a hell of a show. But, as it happened, Straczynski and Zabel never even got to present their pitch to the studio. And in 2006, Paramount began developing a film project that eventually became 2009's Star Trek, a film directed by J.J. Abrams, starring Chris Pine, Carl Urban, and Zachary Quinto as younger versions of Kirk, McCoy, and Spock, in the story of how those three characters first met and found themselves aboard the Enterprise with the rest of the classic crew. Sounds kind of similar to the Straczynski-Zabel pitch, doesn't it? But those similarities aren't nearly as interesting as the fact that this was not the first time a new Star Trek project bore a, some would say, striking resemblance to a project being developed by J. Michael Straczynski, because, as I very coyly neglected to tell you before, but as I'm sure most of you already know, J. Michael Straczynski is the creator of Babylon 5. And ever since that show debuted, fans have been arguing over the question, is Star Trek Deep Space Nine actually a ripoff of Babylon 5? At first glance, the answer seems to obviously be no. Deep Space Nine premiered in January 1993, and Babylon 5 didn't begin airing its first season until a year later. If anybody ripped anybody off, surely it was B5 ripping off DS9, right? But the actual story is a little more complicated than that. First, while B5's first full season didn't premiere until January 1994, the TV movie that introduced the series to audiences aired in February 1993, a month after the debut of DS9. This means Deep Space Nine only appears to have come first. The two shows were actually being developed at the same time. Second, the stories of the two shows don't begin with their entering development, and that's especially true of Babylon 5, which J. Michael Straczynski first started shopping around to TV networks in the late 1980s. He pitched the show to Paramount in 1989, 2 years before Rick Berman and Michael Piller began developing Deep Space Nine. So not only is DS9's earlier premiere date misleading as to which show came first, the real story is exactly the opposite of what that premiere date suggests. Babylon 5, as a concept at least, predates DS9 by several years, which means that if one show was ripped off from the other, DS9 would have to be the ripper and B5 the rip-e. But which show came first is kind of beside the point if there's no reason to think that one was ripped off from the other to begin with. True, the two shows share some superficial similarities. They're both sci-fi adventure series set primarily on space stations, but we're going to need more evidence than two shows with a similar premise. Father Knows Best and All in the Family are both domestic sitcoms, but I don't think there's much of a case to be made that the latter was plagiarized from the former. So, is there more to this DS9 ripped-off B5 thing than the fact that they're both sci-fi shows set aboard space stations? Let's look at some other things the two series have in common. They're both centered on space stations with names that end in single-digit numbers. Babylon 5, Deep Space Nine. Both space stations have diplomatic missions at the start of the respective series. B5 is the latest in a series of space stations constructed to facilitate peaceful relations between previously warring species, while DS9 is a former Cardassian outpost that has since been claimed by the Bajorans and is being operated by Starfleet with the aim of eventually making Bajor a member of the Federation. Both shows have protagonists that become messianic figures and figure prominently in the fulfillment of prophecy. Both shows depict interplanetary wars with religious overtones against powerful adversaries that threaten to destroy the civilizations of the protagonists. Both shows feature recurring characters named Dukat and Lita, though they're spelled differently. Both shows feature alien races that are longtime enemies now struggling to live in peace. The Bajorans and the Cardassians on DS9, the Narn and the Centauri on B5. The names Roddenberry and Straczynski both have 11 letters. When they were children, J. Michael Straczynski and DS9 co-creator Rick Berman both had dogs. Straczynski's dog was named Cisco. Berman's dog was named Sheridan. Babylon 5 executive producer Douglas Netter and Deep Space Nine co-creator and original showrunner Michael Piller both had mothers named Martha. Okay, those last two aren't true. And the bit about their names having the same number of letters doesn't mean shit. But it does seem undeniable that the two shows have some things in common. The question is, to what do we attribute these commonalities? And if we can attribute them to willful cribbing from Babylon 5 by people involved in the development of Deep Space Nine, are they significant enough for us to say that Deep Space Nine is a ripoff? So I guess I should have said the questions are, but who says that? That's not an idiom. Why are there these similarities between the two shows? J. Michael Straczynski has offered multiple explanations. Over the years, in the 1990s, when both shows were in production, Straczynski's opinion seemed to be that while some studio executives who knew about his Babylon 5 pitch may have tried to steer Deep Space Nine in a similar direction, no one who actually worked as a writer or a producer on Deep Space Nine was trying to copy Babylon 5. In fact, in a post he made to a Babylon 5 Usenet group in 1995, Straczynski says that he doesn't think Rick Berman or Michael Piller even knew about his Babylon 5 pitch when they were developing Deep Space Nine. Here's what happened according to Straczynski in 1995. Paramount, which owned Star Trek, and Warner Brothers, which eventually bought Babylon 5, were rival studios. When Paramount decided to produce a new Star Trek series to capitalize on the success of The Next Generation, they didn't want two shows set aboard starships in production at the same time, so the obvious move was to set the new show aboard a space station. And wouldn't you know it, Paramount had a detailed treatment for a sci-fi series set aboard a space station still in its files from when Straczynski pitched them Babylon 5. In the aforementioned Usenet post, Straczynski speculates about what the Paramount execs might have thought. Quote, "Okay, open the file drawer. Let's take a peek at what they're going to do. We won't copy it exactly, but knowing what they're doing will allow us to co-opt a little of their franchise, enough to cut them off at the knees in the marketplace. We won't tell Berman or Piller about this because they would never go along with it, but we'll just guide them here and there. We give notes all the time in development. Who's to know where they came from?" Straczynski goes on to say in that post, quote, "I have never, ever felt or believed or thought that Berman or Piller ever saw or knew about the B5 information. Had anyone suggested anything of a less than straightforward nature, they would have refused. Of that, I have no doubt." So maybe some notes from executives at the studio who had seen the Babylon 5 pitch nudged Deep Space Nine in a similar direction during its development, but the producers and writers who actually worked on the show weren't familiar with the Babylon 5 pitch and so weren't actively cribbing from it, and wouldn't have even if they could. But in a 2013 interview, Straczynski told a different story. Speaking about the problems the existence of Deep Space Nine caused him while he was developing Babylon 5 at Warner Brothers, he described how he received a call from Star Trek veteran and future Babylon 5 recurring cast member Walter Koenig, who told him bluntly that Paramount was stealing his show. Straczynski's paraphrase of what Koenig told him goes like this, quote, "I wanted you to know they're doing a show based on a space station, a diplomatic outpost, jump gate nearby, commander with a sort of a mystical history and destiny, female second in command, and a changeling which you have in your movie. They're trying to subvert what you're doing and co-opt it." Later in that interview, Straczynski says, quote, "It was a pretty obvious riff on our show. In fact, one of the cast members found Peter Jurasik, who played Londo on our show, at a party, pulled him aside and said, 'I want you to know all of us on DS9 know that our show came from your show, and on behalf of the cast, good luck.'" It's important to note a couple of things about that version of the story. First, "they're trying to subvert and co-opt you" bit was Walter Koenig's opinion, not necessarily a fact. Everything else Straczynski paraphrases Koenig saying is consistent with what Straczynski said in the 90s, that Paramount was developing a space station show with similarities to Babylon 5, similarities which could have been due to executive steering, but which the actual producers of Deep Space Nine didn't know about and had nothing to do with. But that interpretation is undercut by the bit about a DS9 cast member telling Peter Jurasik that everyone on DS9 knew that their show was modeled after Babylon 5. If the DS9 cast member in question did say good luck to Peter Jurasik, that might imply that this interaction happened very early on in the run of both shows, perhaps even before Deep Space Nine premiered. So if everybody on DS9 in those early days knew it owed a creative debt to Babylon 5, it kind of makes it hard to believe that none of the actual producers of DS9 were aware of that connection at any point while they were developing the show. I mean, did someone just walk into Michael Pillar's office a week before DS9's pilot premiered and say, "Oh, hey, did you hear Warner Brothers is doing a space station show too?" And that was the first he heard about it? Seems like a stretch. Having said that, even if Berman and Pillar did know about Babylon 5 while they were developing Deep Space Nine, that doesn't necessarily mean they were intentionally ripping it off. It's plausible for the shows to be similar to one another without necessitating some nefarious explanation. If someone at Paramount did want to set a new Star Trek spin-off on a location other than a starship, a space station is a pretty obvious choice, and you wouldn't want the setting of your new show to be unimportant, so making that space station a hub for commerce and diplomacy positioned in a strategically crucial region of space makes sense too. Details like these are less hallmarks and more basic materials. You don't need to steal somebody else's pitch to think of this shit. As you can see, it's easy to find yourself bouncing from one speculation to the next when trying to figure out who knew what and when and how much one project directly influenced the other, if at all. I tend to think Straczynski had it right back in the 90s. A new Star Trek show went into development to be set aboard a space station, and some executive at Paramount who knew about the Babylon 5 pitch passed along some suggestions inspired by that pitch to Deep Space Nine's creative team, and some of those suggestions found their way into the show in one form or another. I don't think that accounts for all of the similarities between the two shows. I think some of those bits I mentioned earlier, like both shows having characters named Lita and Dukat, are just flat-out coincidences. And I don't think it absolutely had to happen the way Straczynski described. Maybe it didn't. But it's reasonable to believe, given the similarities that exist between the shows, and given the fact that Babylon 5 was being shopped around for a few years before Deep Space Nine was created, that it did happen that way. More or less. But that by itself doesn't answer the titular question of this video, because even if we do attribute the similarities between the two shows to someone on the DS9 side cheating off Babylon 5's homework, that doesn't mean those similarities are significant enough to declare DS9 a ripoff. It's one thing to rattle off a list of elements the two shows seem to share, but that doesn't give you the whole picture. What about the ways they differ? When you really examine them, are Star Trek Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5 actually that alike? Oh man, that would have made a good title. Is it too late to go back and change? Yeah, no, it's too late. I'm not reshooting this shit. Let's consider the space stations after which the shows are named. Babylon 5 is described in the opening narration of the show's early seasons as a shining beacon in space. It's new as the series begins, located in neutral territory, and conceived for and dedicated to the purpose of maintaining galactic peace in the aftermath of a devastating war. It's an important place where important things are supposed to happen. On the other hand, as its series begins, Deep Space Nine is an abandoned Cardassian outpost, 30 years old, gutted and sabotaged by its departing former owners, taken over by the Bajorans following a brutal, decades-long military occupation, and administrated by Starfleet. From the perspective of most of the Starfleet personnel, it's an assignment they don't want in a region of space nobody cares about. At first. Let's compare the lead protagonists of each show, because at first glance, they are suspiciously similar to say the least. First, there's John Sheridan, who is the lead of Babylon 5 for most of its run. He joins the cast in Season 2 after original protagonist Jeffrey Sinclair is reassigned and eventually travels back in time to become a Minbari religious figure. It's a whole thing. Sheridan is a veteran of Earth Force who fought in the Earth-Minbari War. He's a widower whose wife was killed when her ship was destroyed by a hostile species. Sort of. That bit is also complicated. He eventually becomes a pivotal figure in history, leading his side to victory in the Shadow War, becoming the first president of the Interstellar Alliance, and is eventually regarded as a mythical messianic figure following his death, which itself occurs under mysterious, mystical circumstances. Then there's Benjamin Sisko, the lead character of Deep Space Nine. He's a Starfleet veteran who served during the Zenkethi War. He's a widower whose wife was killed when their ship was destroyed by a hostile species, and there's no sort of about that one, she's dead. He also leads his side to victory in the Dominion War, becomes a mythical messianic figure as the emissary to the prophets, and vanishes under mysterious, mystical circumstances. But if you look beyond those similarities, I think you'll find them to be two very different characters. Starting with their backstories, Sheridan's Earth-Minbari War experience is a very important part of his life, whereas Sisko's service during the Zenkethi War doesn't seem to have been nearly as consequential to him. We learn about it through a few lines of dialogue to establish Sisko's history with a just-introduced character, and it doesn't come up again all that often. Both characters are widowers, true, and they lose their spouses under broadly similar circumstances, but Sisko is also a single parent. And that's not just a tossed-in character detail. Being a father is a central part of who Sisko is. Sheridan has a son eventually too, but one we're only told about in dialogue. He never actually appears on screen. Both characters lead their sides to victory in wars where their enemies pose existential threats to their civilizations, but Sisko wins his war shortly before meeting his destiny with the prophets, whereas Sheridan lives on for decades and becomes a political as well as military leader. While Ben Sisko is certainly worthy of being called a pivotal historical figure for his role in defeating the Dominion and saving the Federation, it's also fair to say that Sheridan was much, much more significant in the history of his world, and for a much longer period of time. He basically becomes Space George Washington with a little ascension of Jesus thrown in there right at the end for good measure. Despite the similar ending, Sisko can't quite say the same. It's also worth mentioning that Sheridan is white and Sisko is black. That is not a superficial difference. Sheridan's whiteness is never really important, but Sisko's blackness definitely is. The fact that he is a black man matters not just to us in the audience watching the show while living in a world where racial injustice remains an enduring and ever-present problem, but to Sisko himself. His blackness and the discrimination and violence he and people like him face because of it, or used to face from his typical in-universe perspective, is at the center of one of Deep Space Nine's most celebrated episodes, Far Beyond the Stars. It also motivates his initial reluctance to help save Vic Fontaine's 1960s-era Las Vegas nightclub in the episode Bada Bing Bada Bang. I could spend all day pointing out important ways the two shows are not alike, but really, besides the settings and the lead protagonists, the most significant differences between Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine have to do with focus and tone. For the most part, The shows are just interested in telling different stories, and they go about telling them in different ways. In terms of basic plot, Babylon 5 is primarily interested in interstellar politics. Now, it does the show a disservice to offer such a description and leave it at that. Babylon 5 is about a lot more than the political conflicts between its various species. It delves into themes like destiny, sacrifice, the complexities of history and legacy, the moral compromises that are sometimes required in order to do the right thing, the cost of war, and the eternal vigilance demanded by peace. Its characters are rich and multifaceted, its storytelling layered and intricately constructed, and its creative ambition as impressive as any show that's ever been on television. Everywhere in the world of Babylon 5, there is peril and threatening chaos. It's more than the station itself. The universe in which the show takes place is much different than that of Deep Space Nine. On Babylon 5, Earth is still recovering from a war with the Minbari that it almost lost. It is threatened not only by a new, even more catastrophic war from the outside, but also by xenophobia and rising totalitarianism from within. The major alien species are constantly plotting against each other, forming alliances, and then betraying those alliances, occasionally engaging in open warfare. And that's not so different from Deep Space Nine. But what is different is the almost granular attention to detail with which Babylon 5 tells its stories. That closely observed kind of storytelling works well with another aspect of Babylon 5 that is different from Deep Space Nine, how serialized it is. The series is commonly described by Straczynski and others as a novel for television, with each episode functioning more as a chapter in a larger saga than as a standalone story. Each season of Babylon 5 presents its own cohesive narrative, and together all 5 seasons tell a complete story with a beginning, middle, and end. This gives the series a sense of unity and completeness that Deep Space Nine doesn't have, at least not to nearly the same degree. Deep Space Nine is far more serialized than the other Star Trek shows of its era, but it doesn't really start producing regular multi-episode arcs until relatively late in its 7-season run. Unlike Babylon 5, you can't really say that DS9 tells a single overarching story from the first episode to the last. There are definitely threads of plot and character that stretch across multiple seasons, even a few that run from the pilot to the finale, but they're woven together a lot more loosely than those in Babylon 5. Also, because the primary mission of the space station is interstellar diplomacy, and the major focus of the series is on the details of that diplomacy and the consequences that follow from its successes and failures, Babylon 5 doesn't have much in the way of space exploration. We know that Earth and the other spacefaring species do conduct scientific research and visit uncharted regions of the galaxy. We hear about it, we occasionally catch glimpses of it, but the show isn't really about that. Deep Space Nine, on the other hand, is still a Star Trek show at heart, so there's plenty of exploring strange new worlds and seeking out new life and new civilizations in between all the stuff about changelings infiltrating the Alpha Quadrant and the war between the Federation and the Dominion. As a Star Trek show, Deep Space Nine also wears its heart and its social conscience on its sleeve in a way Babylon 5 doesn't. That's not to say that Babylon 5 isn't political, because it definitely is. As I mentioned previously, a major plot thread involves the rise of a corrupt totalitarian government on Earth and the subsequent struggle to get rid of it. And if you don't think that's relevant to our present predicament, you need to take your head out of your ass. But despite its patent and pertinent political content, Babylon 5 doesn't really have episodes like DS9's Far Beyond the Stars or Past Tense that directly address real-world injustices or social problems. Nor does it make a commitment to diversity and inclusion an overt part of its identity as a show in the same way Deep Space Nine and Star Trek in general does. That doesn't mean Babylon 5 doesn't care about those things, just that it doesn't place them in the foreground the same way Star Trek does. Ultimately, the shows are just different. Yes, there are similarities, and yes, it's plausible that some of those similarities are intentional and the result of studio executives steering the creators of Deep Space Nine to include elements from the Babylon 5 pitch which those executives liked. But those similarities aren't nearly significant enough to add up to Deep Space Nine being a ripoff of Babylon 5. If Deep Space Nine is a ripoff of Babylon 5, does that mean Babylon 5 is a ripoff of Star Trek the original series? Both shows take place in the 23rd century and show us a future where humanity has taken its place among the other interstellar powers in the galaxy. Or is Babylon 5 plagiarizing Lord of the Rings when it introduces a group called the Rangers? Or gives Captain Sheridan a character arc with multiple similarities to that of Gandalf? So I'm told. I've never read The Lord of the Rings, and as of this recording, I've only seen 2 of the movies, and the second one only because I had to watch it for a podcast, and what I've seen has been, I don't know, okay, I guess, but also very much not my thing. 2 creative works, even works created around the same time, having things in common does not mean that one was copied from the other. 2 shows can take the same materials and use them to build very different things. In fact, that's not just a quirky thing that happens from time to time, it's kinda how the whole thing works. The book of Ecclesiastes tells us that there is nothing new under the sun. That was written over 2,000 years ago. Think of everything that has been created since then. Almost every book you've ever read, probably every song you've ever heard, definitely every movie you've ever seen. Artists today are exploring the same themes, grappling with the same questions, struggling to understand the same experiences as artists have since time immemorial. They're able to create art, to tell stories that are new and fresh and relevant to the times in which they are made, while also owing a debt to that which came before. That's one of the great things about the creative process and about culture itself. Another great thing is that no matter where you come down personally on the similarities between Deep Space Nine and Babylon 5 and what they mean, you can like both shows. I do. Granted, I prefer Deep Space Nine. Like, a lot. It's not even close. I find it to be the superior show in pretty much every way, but I like Babylon 5 too. I admire its ambition and the epic sweep of its storytelling and the way it's able to evoke myth and fantasy while still remaining grounded in a world that feels plausible. Babylon 5 is a great show, at least from what I remember. Apart from a bit of research for this video, I haven't watched an episode in over 20 years. I mean, come on, what do you want from me? I know I just went through a whole bit about how you don't have to choose between the 2 shows, but for real. It's not for nothing my shirt says Niners and not Fivers. Don't want a Fivers shirt, won't take one. And with good reason. If I did have to choose between the 2 shows, why would I pick the one without Worf over the one with Worf? And yes, I know, Worf doesn't show up on Deep Space Nine until season 4, but that's still 4 solid seasons of Worf compared to Babylon 5, which has no Worf whatsoever. And Deep Space Nine has Riker. For 1 episode, sort of. What's so hard about this? Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I will let you know what the topic of the next Trek Actually video is going to be in a minute, but first, some shout outs to my newest Patreon patrons, and their names are Adam Goss, thank you Adam, Brian Brady, thank you Brian, Mike H, thank you Mike, Ingemar Bjarni Sverrisson, thank you Ingemar, Cassie Volpine, thank you Cassie, Steve Godber, thank you Steve, Grant Byer, thank you Grant, Loretta Reyes, thank you Loretta, Radical Bacon, thank you Radical Bacon, Mad Brad, Virginia's only skeptic, thank you Mad Brad, Shelley Gold, thank you Shelley, Aaron Wagner, thank you Aaron, Frunobulax the Poodle, thank you Frunobulax the Poodle, Christopher Greeby, thank you Christopher, Space Trucker, thank you Space Trucker, And Brian Schwartz, thank you, Brian. Those are the names of the fine folks who have most recently pledged to support this channel through Patreon at a level of $5 a month or more. If you would like to support this channel and help me to continue doing the work that I do, go to patreon.com/Steve Shives and become a patron for as little as $1 a month. That gets you access to the Patrons Only feed, where you can vote in polls for upcoming Trek Actually topics and submit questions ahead of time for my Ask Away live streams. $5 a month or more gets you a shout out, but every pledge of whatever amount really helps me out. I appreciate all my patrons. I could not do this without you. Thank you all so much. An announcement and a reminder before we get to the topic of next month's video. First, on Wednesday, which if you're watching this video on the day it's released is today, I will be hosting a live stream where I read some fan fiction. As some of you know, I do write fanfic. I've read some of it on streams in the past. It's been a lot of fun. Wednesday, that is today, if you're watching this on the release date, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern Time, I'll be reading a Batman fanfic, Batman Sees the Light Part 2. I read Part 1 on a stream last week, which is archived if you missed it, link in the description. And you'll get to hear Part 3 next week. It's a really cool story. Batman, Ra's al Ghul, Talia, even Superman pops in at one point. I think you'll really dig it. I know it ain't Star Trek, but you know what? Not everything has to be about Star Trek, you all, says the guy in the Star Trek shirt presenting the Star Trek video. Anyway, tonight, live, starting at 6 p.m. Eastern. The link to the live stream is in the description of this video. Come watch me read Batman fanfic. You won't be sorry. Or you will. I don't know. I don't really have any control over that. Second, as always, don't forget that besides the Star Trek videos, I also co-host a Star Trek-themed improv comedy podcast called The Ensign's Log. If you enjoy my Star Trek videos, I think you'll really like The Ensign's Log. Give it a listen if you haven't before. We're rounding the final turn, just a few episodes away from the end of our 3rd season. You're going to want to find out what happens. Maybe we'll all die. The show has never been better. I hope if you listen to it, you enjoy it as much as we enjoy making it. Links are in the description. Listen via SoundCloud, at the website, or subscribe via RSS to listen with your favorite podcast app. Check out The Ensign's Log. Now, the topic of next month's video is special for a couple of reasons. First, it won the topic poll on Patreon the very first month it was featured, which doesn't happen all that often. Second, this topic was actually suggested by a viewer. Jared Frazier pitched this topic, and I thought it was a good one and added it to the poll, and lo and behold, it won. And I'm glad it did because it's an interesting topic and it's going to make for a fun video. The topic of the next Trek Actually video will be, does Star Trek actually believe in the chain of command? Because if it does, how come the heroes are always disobeying orders to save the day? Huh? Can you answer that? Actually, I guess I'm supposed to answer it. I better get to work. Thanks for watching, everybody. Take care, and I'll see you next time.